Hi guys, welcome back to Augmenting the Gallery, and we're at week 11 when we talk about museums and utopia. So, the plan for the day is going to be to talk about two things. One is going to be more theoretical, and the other one a little bit more practical, a lot more practical actually. First, we're going to talk about museums and utopia related to the reading we have this week, of how museums can be places for utopia. And then in the second part, we'll talk about the best practices for development, because you've all decided on a particular design for your Museum 5.0 use case. And we now have, as of today, April 20th, 1 month until you have your final presentation with the rest of the team at M4P0. And we'll see in this lecture, and we'll see in recitation, how you can use best practices to make sure that the development of your prototype goes smoothly. So, museums and utopias. The first question is, what is a utopia, right? So it comes from the way we understand it in the modern sense, comes from this guy Thomas More, who wrote a book called Utopia, which was about this island in the middle of nowhere, technically southern Atlantic Ocean, which didn't exist, right? A utopia is a place that doesn't exist, and so you might want to ask, what is the purpose of a utopia? What is a place that doesn't exist, but why do we even talk about it if it doesn't exist? Well, we talk about it because it allows us to imagine what a place could be, or imagine a future, imagine an alternative possibility. You have utopias and you have dystopias. So we usually think of utopias as places that are good, of a utopic ideal or a utopian approach is something that's idealistic. We also talk about dystopias, which are places that you don't want to live in, and that we would try to avoid as much as possible. I'm thinking of Brave New World or 1984. But really what utopias are good for is to make us think about what the world could be, right? There's no such thing as a universally good utopia, a universally bad utopia. You have hippie utopias, you have communist utopias, you have capitalistic utopias, you have fascist utopias, you have all kinds of utopias. It is a proposal of how the world could be, and it is a proposal of what we could do for the future. So really, it's a different approach to the world. And how do museums do that approach to the world? We talked a lot about how museums create meaning, how museums create narratives and reinforce narratives. What I want to highlight now today is how the worlds that the museums create can sort of be evaluated. How we can say this is a worldview, and not just this is the rambling of some curator. And there are three criteria to sort of think about what a utopia could be, how necessary or how beneficial it is to have this utopia presented to us. And those three criteria are usefulness, plausibility, and coherence. Because, as we said, there's no such thing as a truth of like, this is a good utopia, this is a bad utopia, but how useful it is to have this sort of world, and how useful it is insofar as how does it help us think about the rest of our world. An example of that would be how useful is Harry Potter, really? You could have Harry Potter as like the books written by J.K. Rowling that are not very useful because they create a world that doesn't exist. But they recently released a study which shows that people who read Harry Potter when they were kids are significantly or statistically more likely to be tolerant and liberal. So the utopia created by the world of in the world of Harry Potter is actually a useful one to live by. So places that don't exist, but places that deal with mixed race relationship, places that deal with fascism, places that deal with growing up and accepting one's own limitations, all those things that are presented in the world of Harry Potter. The second criteria for the kind of worlds that are imagined by museums are plausibility. How likely is it that this world could have existed? That this possibility could have been the case instead of what really happened through what we know of our historical events. And so some of these might include the development of computer science in the USSR, because computer science was originally a military endeavor and a competition between two different superpowers, the Western Bloc led by the United States on one side and the Eastern Bloc led by the USSR on the other side. And there are things that we think of as sort of obvious, such as like binary code. Binary is binary, binary exists, right? And there's no alternative to binary. It turns out that the USSR was actually researching ternary codes, and that it was possible to think of computing as based on three different values, not just 0, 1, on, off, but on, off, and neutral. That's a plausible world. That's something that engineering-wise is completely possible to think of, and therefore might be useful for us in thinking of technological determinism. Are things always going to be the way they are? Well, they weren't, and they weren't supposed to be. And the plausibility of the alternate scenario is something that is important for us to imagine the future of, in this case, technology. And the last one is coherence. Coherence is when you're presenting multiple exhibits, so museum pieces, really like artworks, cultural works, heritage. How well do they fit into this worldview that you're presenting? How is it that the curator has a statement and each of the pieces that are presented reinforce the statement over and over and reinforce each other to sort of provide a coherent narrative, something that makes sense, that every detail reinforces again and again the point that is trying to be done. So these are the three aspects: usefulness, plausibility, and coherence. The question about utopia and the question about creating futures is then how well does that deal with cultural heritage, right? Because you can think that museums are about objects of the past, about things that have happened, things that we forgot. And it is precisely this aspect of forgetting something that allows museums to become utopias. By suggesting worlds, by suggesting a way of being, a way of doing, a way of making, they create utopias. But the cultural heritage, the fact that it has always been like this, that the Greeks have always done it better, that technology has always been given from who knows where, these can be challenged by sort of highlighting different cultural heritages, right? As we've seen that museums have different communities, each of these communities have cultural heritages, and not all of them are presented in a museum. So what are the different cultural heritages that we can highlight and bring to the front and make us think about what the future could be? When we're thinking about technological determinism and we're thinking about computers have always been computers and they've always been made by genius white men, we've had recently a resurgence in highlighting the role of women in computing, right? And that is a cultural heritage, but it's not a fixed cultural heritage. It's not something that's fossilized and that cannot be changed at all, right? So this relationship of cultural heritage is sort of like extracting what has been overlooked in the past and showing it today, and as a guide, there's a sign that tomorrow can be different. There are two different practices in the works themselves that museums can highlight. First is the artistic research. The artistic research is this process which creates artworks, which is not the only kind of art making process, but is the one that explores possibilities. It's the artistic research that asks questions, that asks the what if, right? This is what we have right now. What if we rearranged it like this? What if we made it in a different situation? And that is the same process as scientific research, really. You start with an overview of literature. You see who the great masters are in your field. You devise a methodology, you test that methodology, you see how people react, and then you sort of refine your end product until you come to a conclusion. And you offer that conclusion usually as a set of questions to your audience. The way that museums present just the final work, it would be as if we had an academic paper that would just show the conclusion, right? It seems completely irrational for the scientific field and for the academic field. It could be the same for the artistic field, right? We could publish letters, papers, scribbles, and sketches of the work as it was being made. In that sense, it highlights what are the possibilities, what are the suggestions that the artist wanted, or the artists wanted to make in that particular work, and sort of what is the alternative world that they're imagining. So this is artistic research, and then closer to the engineering field is that of design. And design has the specific thing or specific aspect of it, which is called speculative design. And speculative design is showing objects as testimonies of a world that could be, right? Because we're talking in broad terms. We might be writing books about it. We might be making movies. It's different when you have an object. And this difference, this object-based difference, is what makes the museum a unique place. So what are these objects that we can display, and what are the explanations we can give in order to make us think about the possible worlds that we might live in the future? And this work here specifically is by Raby and Dunn, a design collective, which came up with the manifesto of speculative design called Speculative Everything. And this is called Spy Maker. And so essentially what this does is it imagines the world in 50 years. And if there is going to be one of the things they imagine in 50 years is ubiquitous digital surveillance. And if that is the case, how do we escape that? And what they propose is this mask for a dog, which blocks vision, smell, and hearing. And then it has a little antenna on top, which stimulates the smell sensing part of the brain in the dog based on how much electromagnetic waves are around. And so the intent is that this could become a dog that would lead you away from the electromagnetic waves, and therefore lead you away from ubiquitous digital surveillance, because you're no longer within the network, and you would be able to have finally some privacy. The question that is asked by this particular object is, by seeing the world in which it integrates itself, and understanding the world that is being suggested by it, do we want to live in a world like this, right? Once it actually becomes real, when it becomes concrete, when there's this item that people would use, this object that people would use to live their lives, such as the Spy Maker, what are the conversations and the actions we can have and take right now to make sure that this world does happen, or make sure that this world does not happen? So these are the two parts of artistic research, which is sort of process-based, and speculative design, which is highlighting an object that represents a world that is to become, right? And so here are now three examples of how museums have approached this sort of utopia making. The first one is on the processes of making a work, which is an exhibition that was at the Haus der Kulturenwelt last year, called Humanity at Work, which was culminated into a final video piece, but the whole room was actually laid out in diagrams and research papers. And so you could see what the process of the artist was, and by process of elimination, by saying, okay, this is what is interesting to us, this is what is not interesting to us, what are the questions that they asked, and what is sort of the headspace that they were in, right? I think we can all agree that there's always a distance between the world as it exists around us and the world in our heads. And so being able to communicate the artistic process and the artistic mindset to the audience is also part of the museum's mission. A second one is, how do you arrange artworks to suggest alternate realities, to suggest other possibilities and other possibilities to perceive the world? So the installation is called Atlas of a Cosmogony, which is at the Museum for Hunting and Fishing, which, unlike what its name might suggest, is an incredibly progressive museum in Paris, which is not so much about the act of hunting and fishing, but about the cultures of hunting and fishing. And so the Atlas of the Cosmogony is an installation that suggests different ways of apprehending animal life. And it sort of blends in the human practices of taking an animal and then displaying it as a trophy, or having particular eating habits, because all animals have eating habits and humans have very specific and interesting ones, and then suggesting that other animals could actually eat like humans. And then that suggests what are the different worlds in which we could live, in which there's a different relationship between animals, or like non-human animals and human animals. Can we think of a world in which animals are going to be given human rights, or in which human rights are going to be turned into animal rights, not two separate things? So arranging our works and showing particular pieces in a bigger context, in the context of the Museum of Hunting in this case, is sort of reflexive and questioning what is the space that we're in right now, and this work being a little window into another space. And then finally, how do museums reactivate forgotten cultural heritage, or cultural heritages that were sort of being frowned upon? And this particular example is by the Brooklyn Museum and their exhibition, The Rise of Sneaker Culture, which looked at all the intricacies of what the sneaker is, both on a technical, on a commercial, on a social level, and what the sneaker culture sort of suggests and tends towards, such as space exploration. Like, you've seen all those sneakers; some of them are crazy, like the ones that they wear for basketball players. It feels like it's a cosmonaut suit or an astronaut suit, and so finding things that are already ingrained in particular communities and then bringing them forward sort of empowers their communities and makes us think about different ways of interacting with the past and therefore improving the future. And in this case, understanding that wearing shoes is not just wearing shoes, for not just wearing loafers, but rather that it's also projecting ourselves, and that fashion is not just some vanity, but is also like a particular means of seeing our identity and projecting our identities and seeing and projecting who we want to become. In terms of how do we practically do that for augmented reality applications, so we see three patterns, right? To suggest better worlds and better tomorrows. We can see that providing paratext and metadata about the artistic process is useful. So paratext is, what are the letters that the artist wrote when they made this piece? What was the original commission? How was it talked about when the piece was originally released? Metadata is who was it bought by? Who funded it at the beginning? Where did the materials come from? And sort of what was the current context in which the piece was made, and how does that help us realize, oh, this is what they meant, or this is what the intent was. And that intent, understanding that intent, is reinforced by viewing the piece itself and viewing the whole process of making the piece. The second one would be suggesting parallel histories. So, for example, just by omitting some things or highlighting some others or replacing some elements with other elements, it becomes it becomes thought-provoking, right? One of the components of creativity is by breaking boundaries. So putting things where they're not supposed to be, or taking things that are supposed to be, taking them out of their natural habitat. So what does it suggest when you take existing languages and existing sort of paradigms like the perspective or the banquet or the dinner table, like the Last Supper, and then you replace it with a different kind of history? So this piece in particular is the dinner party, but which was an itinerant piece for a long time, for like 15 years, and now it's also exhibited at the Brooklyn Museum, and it takes those tropes of the banquet, of the Last Supper, of the sort of canonical Christian influenced art history, and then has all the guests at the banquet be contributors and actors of feminist histories. And so that suggests a parallel history in which instead of having a banquet where all the men congratulate themselves, you can have a banquet where all the women congratulate themselves, and form a community and highlight this aspect of community which might have been obscured by a particular patriarchal way of seeing things. And then finally, telling a story from different perspectives. So instead of having a particular work that is seen by, say, like an art historian, then how does it feel if it is if that work is seen by the person inside the work? So instead of having, again, the Mona Lisa as sort of this historical emblem, who is the Mona Lisa, and who was she, and how did she feel about being a portrait, and what was the relationship of middle higher class women in Italy to their own images? Like, did they get to commission their own painting? Was it for someone else? Was it always men that commissioned paintings of women? Was it women who commissioned paintings of themselves? What were they used for? And how does the context of the time can inform the context today? And in this particular case of the portrait, are images and selfies. So when you develop your applications, and if you want to suggest new ways of thinking about the world, those three components are important. Additional metadata, additional paratexts, informing the process, suggesting parallel histories by sort of recombining the familiar language elements that we have with obscured parts of our history. And then simply switching the perspective, thinking, oh, but what if we listen to that person instead of this person? Which voices are the ones that we can't hear, and which voices are the ones that we constantly hear?